This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Palestinians send fire kites from Gaza to burn the Jews. What can stop them? And a look at the Gaza border where tens of thousands are trying to break the fence. Plus, the Jerusalem prayer breakfast, Jews and Christians praying together for the peace of Jerusalem. And a look back at the Six-Day War and the battle over Jerusalem. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. We're coming to you this week from the Israeli-Gaza border, where behind me you can see the smoke rising from tires burning and where hundreds of Gazans have come to the border. It's all part of the Great March of Return, where more than 2 months Palestinians have protested violently, where they've tried to breach the border fence, launch rockets into Israel, and come up with a new weapon called terror fire kites, intended, as they say, to burn the Jews. It can't get much more low-tech than this, yet the flying fire kites or balloons have caused extensive damage to southern Israeli crops and nature reserves.
As you see, it's burned from a kite that the Palestinians sent us as a present 3 weeks ago.
Ofer Lieberman is the agriculture manager at Kibbutz Niram, less than a mile from the Gaza border. In the last 6 weeks, his kibbutz has lost 250 acres of wheat, 500 acres of cow pasture, and 25 acres of trees that were older than the state of Israel.
We stand here with tractors and equipment. When we see the fire, we just run with the tractors and try to stop it as quickly as we can.
It's part of the Great March of Return, where tens of thousands of Palestinians repeatedly attack the border fence with Israel. Palestinians posted this video with triumphant music on Facebook showing border infiltrations. Some have been killed or captured trying to do so. Israel is working on solutions to combat this latest weapon, and some are calling for targeted assassinations for those who are sending the kites. But Israeli Construction and Housing Minister Yoav Gallant says the Palestinians are desperate.
The kites and the civilian so-called marches towards defense are signs of frustration because all the operational military ways were almost blocked by Israel. The sea is closed, the land is closed. It's very difficult to hit Israel by rockets and missiles because of Iron Dome. We are in a project that will block eventually the tunnels. Despite the trouble, Lieberman says he still has friends in Gaza.
I speak with them about once a week. My friends say that a lot of people in Gaza want the Israeli get inside to throw out the Hamas.
Lieberman says his kibbutz is growing, and he's optimistic for the future.
Here it's heaven, 23 hours a day. 1 hour it's hell, but normally this place it's heaven. I hope it will be like this 24 hours a day, and I hope that we will live in peace.
Joining me to talk more about the situation here on the Gaza-Israeli border is CBN News correspondent Julie Stahl. Julie, behind me we probably see hundreds, if not thousands of Gazans that have come to the border, and yet the IDF had sent out messages by leaflets warning them not to come. What did they say?
Yeah, that's true. They warned them, don't come, don't show up. They said a wise man takes into account the consequences of his actions ahead of time. And they're really telling people, don't show up here. Don't participate in violent protests. It goes on to say, don't let Hamas take you hostage. Because the people they're following Hamas, and it's going to lead to death and nowhere.
Yeah, and we actually talked to a woman here that lives right here on the border. What did she have to tell us? I thought it was very enlightening.
Yeah, it really was. She said, the people here have a lot of compassion on the mothers and the children in Gaza, but enough's enough, and they don't want to see it anymore.
Yeah, and their children, actually, children here in Israel, they live with the same booms that they hear in Gaza. They live with the fires. I mean, we see the fires, evidence of the fires all around us. Yeah. Many of these fields are scorched. It's a crude, but it's a very effective weapon, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very effective. I said you couldn't get much more low tech than this, but it's destroyed 2,500 acres of agricultural land, another 700 acres of forest. It's it's destructive, and they're aiming really not just to destroy crops, they're really aiming to kill the Jews.
Yeah. And what is the motivation? And we actually, by the way, we've seen several of those kites flying off in the distance. We don't know if they've actually crossed into Israel. But what is the motivation when you talk about Hamas and some of the Islamic radical groups inside Gaza? What do they want?
Well, their bottom line is they want to destroy Israel. They want to get rid of the Jews. This probably won't do it, but what they are hoping is to provoke Israel to retaliate, create a big public uproar, and then by that way somehow force Israel to do what they want them to do.
And that's what that woman was saying earlier as well. Provoke Israel, Israel responds, and then that goes to the International Criminal Court or the United Nations Security Council. Julie, just a few hours ago we left Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. Right now, what's going on? It's a big contrast to what's here on the border.
It sure is. Here we have all this violence and destruction, and in Jerusalem, the Israel police made it possible for 190,000 Muslims to come and pray on the Temple Mount at Al-Aqsa Mosque today. It's the last Friday of Ramadan. It's a holy, holy time for them. And 90,000 of them came from the West Bank, and they're the kinsmen of the Gazans. But Israel made a way for them to come because it's special to them. It's holy to them. It's the Temple Mount for the Jews. But they let the Muslims to come and pray there.
Coming up, a look at the battle over Jerusalem during the 1967 Six-Day War. In June 1967, Israel reunited Jerusalem in what many believe was one of the greatest military victories of all time, the Six-Day War. 51 years later, Palestinians mark that as what they call the Nakba, or the setback, as a tribute for the 50th anniversary of what many see as God's victory. CBN Documentaries produced In Our Hands, The Battle for Jerusalem. And CBN's Scott Ross interviewed the writer and director of the film in Jerusalem.
By 4:30 a.m., the Israelis had reached the Jordanians' command bunker. For the next 45 minutes, they lined the opening of the bunker with 21 pounds of TNT.
This is Ammunition Hill. This is the site of what is still today the bloodiest battle in Arab-Israeli history.
I talked with In Our Hands, the Battle for Jerusalem writer and director, CBN's Aaron Zimmerman. The docudrama tells the story of Israel's victory in the city during the 1967 Six-Day War through the eyes of the paratroopers.
Did you do reenactments here?
We did. The people who run Ammunition Hill were very great to us, and they let us have the run of the place for 2.5 nights. We had snipers shooting from the bunkers. We had them crawl through the grass, up the hill, through the barbed wire. They even showed us the original bunker. The battle kind of ended when the Israelis got to the top of the hill, and they found the Jordanian command bunker. And they took 21 pounds of TNT and blew that sucker into next week. And so they showed us that, and they said, well, you're welcome to use this bunker again to stage your explosion. And we thought, great. You know, if it survived a real explosion, it can survive a fake movie one.
Based entirely on facts, the film includes dramatizations of important scenes like Commander Motogur talking to troops on the Mount of Olives.
We are sitting on a ridge overlooking the old city, and soon we shall enter it. The old city of Jerusalem, which generations have dreamed of and longed for. We will be the first to enter.
And running through the streets of Jerusalem under threat of sniper fire to take the Temple Mount and Western Wall.
We had done another docudrama, The Hope, about the beginning of Israel. And we thought, what's the next chapter in that story? And we went to 67, and it's such a great story. And we thought, well, let's not do a dry documentary. Let's get to know some of the men who actually lived it.
And digging into all the background, historical data, etc., that must have been an enormous undertaking.
I tried to use primary sources as much as I could. I tried to use people's diaries. I tried to use minutes from Israeli government meetings. I used personal interviews, but all of the dialogue in the film was recorded in history.
As a result of the war, Israel tripled in size, beating the combined armies of Syria, Egypt, and Jordan to win the Golan Heights, the Sinai Desert, and Judea and Samaria, and reuniting beloved Jerusalem.
To cover the whole war would take too much time. So we narrowed it down to the Battle of Jerusalem, and then we narrowed it down further to one group of men, the 55th Paratrooper Brigade. And I really liked them because they weren't regular army. They were the reservists. They were a little bit older. They were the husbands and the fathers and the businessmen. And they were the guys that ended up going into Jerusalem.
Let's go. Step on it, Bensu.
I mean, these actors are very realistic.
Oh, they're great, yeah.
Did it have an effect on the actors themselves? Because it's more than just history. This is in many cases, their fathers, their grandfathers. They're depicting this. How did they respond to that?
I had a lot of guys tell me their personal family histories. I had so many guys say to me, well, my grandfather was in the Holocaust, or my grandfather, in one case, Sharon Friedman, who played Montagor, his grandfather was one of the guys who fought for Jerusalem in '48 and saw the whole siege and everything.
The little woman who came and offered up the flag, she wanted that flag to be used and flown
at the Western Wall.
At the Western Wall. I mean, that brought tears to my eyes.
Oddly enough, the paratrooper Yoram Zamosh, who's part of that story, I asked him, did you ever see that family again? And he said, we did. And he said, a few months after the war, the old grandmother had passed away.
Really?
She was waiting. She had lived through getting kicked out of her home in '48, and she had lived through all of that, hoping to see Jerusalem reunited.
From start to finish, Zimmerman worked on the film for just a year.
But was there anything that you uncovered, something unknown, something that you just didn't know anything about at all?
What was interesting to me was the response to the paratroopers. When they came into town, they were heroes. These families came out. Now, keep in mind, there was also a blackout because of the Jordanian shelling. There was all of that going on, and still these women would come out of their houses with food.
How did it affect you personally?
From the film side, I learned what an amazing thing can happen when everybody works together and you have so many good people doing what is their specialty, whether it's training the army, whether it's doing makeup, whether it's doing explosives. What I took away from the war, there are two things you can do in life. You can practice and plan, and just the hard work and living something to see that result come out the way that it did. Or you can be in a situation like the paratroopers where you train for one thing, then life throws you another way. And can you adapt to that?
I asked Zimmerman what she wants the audience to take away from the film.
Well, two things. I tried hard to keep it as apolitical as possible to give it a wider audience. Number one, I want them to see the sacrifice that these men made. Number two, we went back 20 years to 1948 to what happened when the Jewish quarter fell and the Jordanians ethnically cleansed every Jew from the old city of Jerusalem. And then at the end of this segment, the Jordanian officer says, we have so completely destroyed this place that no Jew can ever return here. So then we fast forward 19 years and show how they did.
And what will Israelis think of the film?
I hope it will be good. I want people to take away a pride in their heritage.
And after all the bloodletting and everything else that's occurred here historically, there's no way that Israel, Jews are going to give up this city.
No, I don't think so. I mean, Moshe Dayan said it when he got to the Western Wall. We've come to the city never to depart from it again.
Scott Ross at Ammunition Hill in Jerusalem.
Up next, the voice of calm that guided Israelis through that turbulent time before the Six-Day War. The spring of 1967 was a time of almost unbearable tension for Israel's leaders. Threats of invasion came from nearly every direction, and Western nations turned their backs on the Jewish state. Egypt closed the Red Sea Straits, and Syria bombed villages in the Galilee. But in the midst of Israel's darkest hour, a voice of calm emerged to describe the coming miracle. John Waggy explains.
By the end of May 1967, the die was cast. Israel would soon be at war on all borders. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol tried to reassure the nation, but he was ill and faltered during his address. Military General Chaim Herzog stepped in to fill the gap with radio commentary in Hebrew and English.
A new page has been opened in the history of our people's battles and of the courage of Israel. And deep in the heart of each and every one of us at this moment, when we think of those engaged in the struggle, there is, irrespective of whether we normally pray or not, a prayer that the guardian of Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep.
During the Six-Day War, Chaim Herzog didn't just calm the nation. He became Israel's first military ruler over Judea and Samaria in more than 2,000 years. He was also a powerful presence as UN ambassador and later as president of Israel. Chaim Herzog died in 1997, but his legacy lives on. His son Isaac is now chairman of Israel's leading opposition party, the Zionist Union. He was only 7 when the war broke out. Still, he remembers the prevailing fear.
What we know is that there was a period of awaiting about 3 weeks before the war, where the national mood was Auschwitz. Israel is going to its second Holocaust. Whoever leaves last should turn off the light and leave the country. That was the mood.
Isaac's older brother, Michael, now a retired major general, was 15 at the time. He says there's no doubt Israelis were concerned about the nation's survival.
So I still remember ourselves, like many other people in Israel, digging trench in our backyard because we expected that we would be shelled, and we were shelled. Tel Aviv was shelled by the Jordanians during the Six-Day War.
Young people who have abandoned the cafes of Dizengoff Street and the discotheque, the farm boys, the yeshiva students, the members of the youth movements, the boys of the immigrant townships, all are at this moment shoulder to shoulder fighting in the air, on the land, and on the sea for our right simply to live.
You know what's interesting is we hear a lot today about the term fake news and that kind of thing. 67 was a banner year for fake news, especially in Egypt and in Syria, and your father was kind of counteracting that to a people that didn't know really what was happening. They had to hear the truth.
We would hear what was called Kol Kahir, Voice of Cairo, and they would speak in Hebrew, and they would say the worst things. We're going to throw you to the sea. I guess you heard it.
They said terrible things, and people were, there was anxiety, but he provided very professional analysis. He first of all, he knew the situation.
I am broadcasting from Jerusalem to the sound of heavy shelling. A strange form of quiet and anticipation has fallen along the front line, a quiet that may foretell great tidings.
He would broadcast 3 times a day. He would also broadcast in English, so there were both BBC and others, but the 3 times a day you would walk in the streets of Tel Aviv and you would hear his voice throughout the city, people just listening, stopping and listening. And it was awesome. I heard his voice in the trench. I heard my dad, my mom brought a little radio, and we would hear him in the trench, and he calmed us down.
I was told by soldiers then in the front lines, and they would listen to him, and I was told by quite a few of them that this really boosted their morale before going into battle.
Just 1 day into the war, Israel's Air Force virtually destroyed the capacity of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan to strike from the air. On the ground, Israel's army penetrated deep into the Sinai and pushed toward Jordan on the West Bank. By day 3, Chaim Herzog could tell the nation the unthinkable. After 2 millennia, Jerusalem was back in Jewish hands.
The miracle of our generation continues, as does the brilliant campaign, the like of which there is no record of in the history of Israel, and perhaps in the history of the nations, and which has achieved today what millions of Jews throughout the generations have prayed for.
We live in a very different era than 1967, but in my mind, what our father, the impact his broadcast had on the national morale is reminiscent of the impact that Churchill's broadcast had on British morale during World War II, and that was very significant.
And indeed, the saying goes, Jerusalem is a gift of the whole land of Israel. On the altar of the Temple Mount and Mount Moriah, the people of Israel offered up today priceless sacrifices which swell the toll of sacrifice by earlier generations. Our victory was not lightly achieved, and at this moment it is well that we remember those who offered up their lives for the glory of the Almighty and the nation.
Today, both Herzogs are strong supporters of a 2-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians, despite growing skepticism about the peace process among many Israelis.
There is a golden opportunity in the region whereby you just need to stretch your hand, and under American support, especially I believe from the White House, there could be a sea change in the region, Israel being recognized by all its neighbors, and we need to sit down and get to the difficult moment of trying to make peace. This is what we owe to the casualties who fell in the war, who were so brave in very difficult battles, and to the fact that we want the Jewish nation to live in peace and strength in the region whilst celebrating that great victory.
John Wagi, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Coming up, the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast. Jews and Christians pray together for the peace of Jerusalem. Hundreds of Christians from 70 nations gathered in Jerusalem, along with Israeli Knesset members and Jewish leaders for the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast, initiated by Knesset member Robert Ilatov and co-chaired by former U.S. Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann. It's all part of a global movement to encourage Jews and Christians to pray for the peace of Jerusalem.
I've been working and trying to bring Jews and Christians together for a few years, and I'm shocked at just the outpouring of love that was at the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast.
This is a prayer breakfast that really did what it says. It prayed, and we prayed together, and we sensed God.
I think it was an amazing and historic event to see so many nations come together in Jerusalem to celebrate the 70th anniversary, but also to pray for global recognition of Jerusalem for what it is, the capital of modern state of Israel.
I think about the fact that God is joining the Jews and the Christians together for such an event. This is a wonder.
The Bible is very clear. We should pray for the peace of Jerusalem. If there's nothing else we can agree on, we have to agree with the Word of God. And I think the world really is craving to see this peace of Jerusalem become a reality. So I think the fact that we are coming together, standing on truth and praying this very biblical prayer will have an impact.
We're a part of the future even today in this miraculous meeting, and we are to pray as watchmen on the wall. We pray because God told us to pray.
It's a great reminder to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and also pray for the protection of Israel here on the Israeli-Gaza border. Well, that's all for this edition. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.